The laughter hit Ethan first. It was a sound too clear, too easy, ringing against the dull drone of the cafe noise. It was the sound he hadn't and Apo's. T heard in the 6 months since his life became nothing but cold regret, the sound he had traveled back in time to save. He stood frozen outside the corner bistro, his hand hovering near the brass handle. He saw his own reflection in the glass. A gaunt, exhausted man in cheap, rumpled clothes, and superimposed over that image was the ghost of his future self. Hollow-eyed, defeated. He knew his mission. Do not walk out. Stay and fight for her. He had failed. Inside, bathed in the warm, dangerous light of the window booth, sat Lily Rowan. Her red hair was messy, the lines of exhaustion still etched around her eyes, but the defensive tension he remembered from the morning discussion was gone. The man across from her was Marcus Whitlow, clean, calm, wearing a sweater that looked expensive and comforting. Marcus was leaning in, speaking softly, offering the kind of stable emotional ground Ethan had always denied her. Lily was smiling at Marcus's words, a genuine, unguarded smile. Ethan had only been gone for 3 minutes. He had walked out during their argument, just like the first time, paralyzed by the fear that always forced his retreat. He believed he could run around the block, catch his breath, and come back before the true damage was done. He thought the time travel protected him. He was wrong. 3 minutes was all the universe needed to introduce a viable alternative. Ethan pushed the heavy glass door open, the sharp chime announcing his doomed return. The sound cut through the cafe chatter. Lily's eyes snapped up, catching his. There was no surprise, no relief, only the deep, weary confirmation of his worst failure. He saw the end of his second chance solidified in the dead space between them. To understand how he allowed the moment that destroyed his life to repeat itself, how he walked out of that cafe twice. We must go back to 8 a.m. this morning, when Ethan Hale woke up fully aware of the disaster ahead. Ethan Hale sat rigidly at the small, worn table. The scent of burnt sugar and old coffee grounds was overwhelming, exactly as he remembered. Rain sheeted against the window of the golden mug, distorting the familiar street lamps into yellow smears. He was back. Not months ago, not years, but exactly 8 minutes before the defining moment that had cleaved his life in two. Across from him, Lily Rowan was stirring her lukewarm latte. Her red hair was pulled back haphazardly, a single strand escaping to brush her cheek. She looked tired, vulnerable, but utterly captivating in the way she always did when their conversations started to fray. "Ethan, I'm just trying to understand," she said, her voice thin, a sound like glass fracturing. "If we can't talk about the budget without you shutting down, how are we supposed to plan a future?" He watched her lips move, every word a landmine he had previously stepped on. In the future he had escaped, this was the precise moment he had accused her of being overly dramatic, dismissed her legitimate fears about their instability, and then, feeling cornered, launched his famous defensive retreat. This time it would be different. He breathed in deeply, the air tasting like panic and stale caffeine. "You're right, Lily," he managed, the words sticking in his throat, unfamiliar in their simple admission of guilt. "I get defensive. It's not fair to you. I'm listening now." Lily's eyes, usually sharp and quick, softened fractionally. That small flicker of hope was the hardest thing to witness. It was the future he destroyed, still shimmering, still attainable. "We need consistency, Ethan. Not just financially, but emotionally. When things get difficult, you leave. You don't just leave the room, you leave the entire conversation. I can't build a life on that empty space." The truth of her statement hit him like a physical blow. He knew she was right, but knowing the truth and managing the crushing emotional weight of that truth were two entirely separate challenges. His chest tightened. The old, toxic impulse, the deep-seated need to escape uncomfortable vulnerability, began to crawl up his spine. He had promised himself he would stay seated. He had played this scene 1,000 times in his head, vowing to lean forward, to hold her hand, to apologize until his voice was raw. But the internal pressure cooker was reaching its limit. The sheer memory of the despair of his future self, the lonely apartment, the silence, the realization of what he'd thrown away, was now paradoxically fueling his current anxiety. The ghost of failure was crowding the table. "Give me a second," he mumbled, reaching instinctively for the table edge, preparing to push off. Lily's expression hardened immediately, the hope extinguished as quickly as a blown-out match. "Give you a second for what, Ethan? To walk away again? We are talking right now." The accusation was precise. She saw the pattern even before he completed the action. He felt the familiar, hot rush of irrational anger. Anger not at her, but at his own weakness being exposed. He was supposed to be the man who fixed things, the man who knew the future, but his subconscious was dragging him back to the fatal script. "I just need to clear my head. It's too much in here," he said, the old, flimsy excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. He needed the air. He needed the temporary illusion of control that walking away offered. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. It was a terrible, decisive sound. Lily watched him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just watched the man who was supposed to be her future choose the door again. Ethan turned abruptly and moved toward the exit. He paused, his hand gripping the cold metal push bar of the door. In the glass reflection, he saw his own face, haggard and panicked, overlaid with the image of the ruined man he had been, a visual echo of his deep regret. He flinched, recognizing the pattern repeating itself. "I'll be right back," he insisted, throwing the promise over his shoulder, a weak tether to the moment he was destroying. He pushed out into the wet, cold air, the door sighing shut behind him. He stood on the sidewalk, rain misting his face, trying to force oxygen into his lungs. "I stopped it," he told himself, leaning against the damp brick wall. "I knew I was leaving. I know I have to go back. I'm stronger now. This time, I only need 1 minute." He closed his eyes, counted to 60, and rehearsed the exact, humble apology he would deliver. He straightened his damp shirt, pushed the guilt-ridden exhaustion from his face, and reached for the door handle. This was the correction. This was the second chance. He stepped back inside, ready to reclaim his destiny. The golden mug felt different, quieter, though only a minute or two had passed. He scanned the room, his eyes snapping immediately to table 4, the familiar spot by the window. Lily was still there, but she wasn't alone. A man occupied the chair Ethan had just vacated. The sight was so physically jarring it felt like an electrical shock. Ethan stopped dead just inside the threshold, water dripping from his coat, instantly forgotten. The man was Marcus Whitlow. Clean lines, a tailored navy sweater, calm posture, and an air of complete and utter stability. He was leaning across the table, his head tilted attentively, listening to Lily speak. And Lily was smiling. Not the strained, fragile smile she offered when she was trying to reassure Ethan that things were fine. This was genuine, easy laughter. A sound Ethan hadn't Apo's. T heard from her in months, not even in the timeline he was trying to erase. She lifted a hand, brushing away the loose red strand, and as she did, her fingers lightly grazed Marcus's wrist. It was an involuntary, relaxed gesture of familiarity that spoke volumes about how quickly and completely Marcus had taken his place. Ethan could see the remnants of her tears on the edges of her eyes, but Marcus was already smoothing them over, offering an immediate balm to the wound Ethan had just inflicted. Marcus looked up, catching Ethan and Apo's frozen stare across the crowded space. His gaze wasn't hostile, just composed, a look of quiet, assured ownership. He gave Ethan a small, polite nod, the kind reserved for a stranger who mistakenly wandered into an intimate moment. The single minute Ethan had stolen, believing he could control time, had been more than enough. He hadn't paused their life. He had simply created a vacancy, and Marcus had filled it instantly, seamlessly. Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him. The regret, which had previously been a heavy weight, now became a frantic, visceral terror. He had failed to change his pattern, and the universe had immediately installed the stable, consistent replacement that Lily had always deserved. He had returned, not to fix the mistake, but to witness the immediate, devastating consequence of repeating it. The establishment of his new reality was complete. He had the second chance, but he was already too late. He was outside, looking in at the life he had just handed to another man. The cold, objective realization settled deep in his gut. The only way to get her back was to become someone Marcus Whitlow could never be. And he had to do it before Lily fell irrevocably in love with the security he had abandoned. The glass of the cafe door was a mirror, catching Ethan's reflection. Not just the man standing there, exhausted and disheveled, but the ghost of the man he was supposed to become, the one consumed by the future's regret. He saw Lily throw her head back and laugh, a genuine, unrestrained sound he hadn't heard from her in years, certainly not in the moments before he walked out. Marcus had his hand resting near the coffee cup, but his gaze was locked on Lily, attentive, steady. Ethan shoved the door open. The bell above the entrance chimed too loudly, cutting through the low murmur of the afternoon crowd. Lily flinched, pulling her hand back instantly. Her smile dissolved into a mask of cautious exhaustion when she saw him. Marcus, however, barely moved. He watched Ethan approach, his expression transitioning from pleasant interest to mild, protective concern. "Lily," Ethan said, his voice thick, tasting of stale air and panic. He tried to project casual ownership, the natural right of someone who belonged there. I forgot my keys." He hadn't forgotten anything. His keys were in his pocket. He needed an anchor, any excuse to break the symmetry between the two people sitting at his table. Lily looked down at her hands. "They're not here, Ethan. Right? Must be in the car." He moved toward the table. It was the same table from the future he remembered, the small, round oak surface, but the dynamics were violently altered. He hovered, hoping the spatial intrusion would force Marcus to leave. Marcus didn't budge. He looked at Ethan with an easy politeness that was more infuriating than open hostility. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, his voice low and stable, the antithesis of Ethan's frantic energy. Ethan looked at the empty chair opposite Lily. It was supposed to be his chair. "We were just talking about the project deadlines at the firm." Lily intervened quickly, clearly attempting to diffuse the tension. She didn't look at Ethan's eyes. "Lily, can we talk outside? Just for a second." Ethan pleaded, dropping the forced casualness. The time was slipping away. If he didn't reassert himself, this moment would solidify into the future he was trying to escape. Lily sighed, a tired, deep sound that spoke of months of accumulated frustration. "Ethan, we finished talking half an hour ago. You know that." "I know, but she was pretty shaken up when I found her," Marcus interjected smoothly, leaning forward just enough to block Ethan's line of sight to Lily. "She needed someone to listen without judging. That's all." "I'm her boyfriend," Ethan snapped, the title feeling hollow and fragile as it left his mouth. Marcus met his gaze directly. "Right now, you're the guy who walked out." The accusation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He wanted to rage, to explain the time loop, to justify his fear, but he couldn't. He had repeated the action. He had earned this judgment. He looked back at Lily. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus. There was a flicker of gratitude there. The terrible realization that Marcus was offering her comfort immediately, while Ethan had left her stranded with the emotional rubble. Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He wasn't fighting an event. He was fighting a choice that had already been made in her heart long before he left the room. He retreated, mumbling an apology that didn't make sense, his hands shaking. He left the cafe again, the bell chiming his humiliating defeat. He ran to his car, fumbling for his phone. He needed context. He needed to understand how Marcus, the stable, perfect-sounding Marcus, could have materialized so quickly. He dialed Claire. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Claire, where are you? I need to talk to you about Marcus. Who is he? How long has he been around?" Ethan demanded, driving too fast through the residential streets, abandoning the original plan entirely. "Ethan, slow down. Marcus Whitlow? He's the new hire in accounting." "Why? New hire? When?" About 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. Why does it matter? Ethan pulled over violently, gravel spitting under his tires. 6 weeks. That timeline was wrong. In his memory of the original timeline, Marcus wasn't a factor until months after the breakup. 6 weeks ago? That's before the original fight. He knew her then. Claire's voice softened, laced with cautious warning. Ethan, you need to hear me. Marcus was introduced to Lily by management. They worked closely on the Q3 report. They were friends. They bonded over the stress you were putting her under. Ethan's breathing hitched. This was the turning point, the awful revelation he hadn't accounted for. The loop hadn't just reset the time of the argument. It had thrown him back into a timeline where the roots of his replacement were already established and thriving. I thought the fight was the beginning of the end. The trigger. The trigger was the symptom, Ethan, not the disease, Claire said sternly. Lily didn't wake up yesterday and decide to move on. She spent the last year dealing with your emotional unavailability, your mood swings, the constant threat that you might explode or walk away. Marcus wasn't an intruder. He was a port in a storm that you created and refused to fix. Claire's words sliced through his constructed narrative of innocence. He hadn't just created a temporary void by walking out for 3 minutes. He had spent 6 weeks, perhaps 6 months, digging the hole that Marcus effortlessly filled. His panic escalated into full-blown obsession. He couldn't and oppose. He go back and fix one moment if the foundation was already compromised. He needed to neutralize Marcus. Where are they now? Ethan whispered, the need to find them overwhelming. I have no idea. Ethan, don't do anything stupid. You need to give her space. You need to focus on what you're going to do differently, not who you're going to blame. He ignored her. Space meant time, and time was Marcus's ally. Marcus had stability, consistency, and now shared history within this new loop. Ethan only had regret and the knowledge of a destroyed future. He hung up and drove back toward the cafe district, but he kept his distance. He found a hiding spot behind a newspaper stand across the street, his collar pulled up, watching. He saw them emerge 10 minutes later. Lily wasn't clinging to Marcus, but she wasn't pulling away either. As they walked side by side, Marcus spoke, and Lily nodded, a gentle, understanding rhythm to their conversation. Marcus reached out and adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. A small, familiar gesture that spoke volumes about their proximity and comfort level. This was the profound difference. In his original future, Lily was broken and alone after he left. In this timeline, Lily was already being cared for, gently transitioning away from him. Ethan felt a crushing weight. He had returned to fix a singular action, but the true tragedy was that he had returned too late to fix the cumulative failure of being a partner. He stayed there, watching them until they disappeared around the corner. The image of Marcus adjusting her bag looped in his mind, sharp and constant. He hadn't failed at the critical moment. He had failed in all the small moments leading up to it. And now, the cost was the definitive presence of another man. The escalation was complete. He was no longer trying to fix the past. He was fighting a future that had already taken root. Desperation turned into a grim resolve. He wooed and oppose. He let Marcus have her without a fight. A fight he now realized had to be against himself first. He knew exactly what Marcus offered, and he knew exactly what he had to stop offering. Chaos. But changing his deep-seated patterns felt like a task more immense than time travel itself. Ethan stepped across the threshold, the small brass bell above the door jingling like a final warning chime. The sound cut the low hum of cafe conversation instantly. He saw Lily and Marcus freeze. They had been leaning together, sharing some private joke. A lightness in Lily's eyes Ethan hadn't witnessed in years, or perhaps had never truly appreciated. Marcus's hand went instinctively to the back of Lily's chair, a gesture of immediate, quiet defense. Ethan didn't look at Marcus. His focus was entirely on Lily, on the simple, devastating fact that in the few minutes he had wasted trying to gather courage, she had found solace in the arms of someone else. End quote. Lily, end quote. He whispered, his voice dry and cracking. tasting of the regret he had carried for 2 years in the future. She stood slowly, her face a complicated map of exhaustion and relief. And quote, "Ethan, you came back?" And quote, "I always come back," end quote. He pleaded, taking a step toward their table, the table that now housed a third presence. And quote, "This is it. This is the moment. I know what I did. I left before and I lost everything. I came back to fix it, to tell you I'm sorry, to prove that I won't walk out again." End quote. Marcus cleared his throat, his tone measured and steady. End quote. "Ethan, maybe now ISN and Oppos. T the best time. Lily just needs some peace." End quote. End quote. "Stay out of this, Marcus." End quote. Ethan spat, ignoring the man's calm logic. It was the stability of Marcus that threatened him most. End quote. "This is between us. Our life. Our future." End quote. End quote. "Your future." End quote. Lily corrected him, her voice startlingly steady. End quote. "You were talking about a future I haven't seen in a long time, Ethan. When you walked out, I thought you were coming back in 5 minutes. You came back 2 years later, just to relive the pain." End quote. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the edge of the nearest table, trying to ground himself in the present, forcing himself to remember the cold reality of the future he had been trying to escape. End quote. "I saw what happens when I leave." End quote. Ethan said, desperation pouring out. End quote. "The loneliness, the mess, the empty house. It's a lifetime of punishment for 5 minutes of cowardice. I won't let that happen again. I swear I won't." End quote. He moved closer to Lily, trying to take her hands, but she held them firmly behind her back. End quote. "That's the core of the problem, Ethan." End quote. Lily countered, stepping slightly behind Marcus, a movement that hit Ethan harder than any punch. End quote. It wasn't 5 minutes of cowardice. It was a pattern. The pattern of choosing fight over connection. The pattern of walking away the second things got uncomfortable. End quote. He saw the future he feared reflected not in his memory, but in her eyes. It was already here. End quote. "But I'm here now, trying to fight for us." End quote. Ethan insisted, his voice rising, drawing more stares from the scattered patrons. End quote. "Don't you understand? I broke the loop. I came back. I am changing." End quote. End quote. "You walked out 5 minutes ago." End quote. Marcus stated simply. The quiet observation was devastating. Marcus wasn't an Oppos. T accusing, he was just stating a fact. Ethan had proven himself unreliable in this new, critical timeline too. Ethan looked at the empty space where he had stood moments earlier, overwhelmed by fear and insecurity. The truth hit him with the force of an oncoming train. His intention to change meant nothing if his underlying reflex was still to flee. He hadn't and Oppos. T changed. He had simply delayed the inevitable. He stared at the reflection in the glass door behind him. For a fleeting second, the younger, anxious Ethan overlapped with the gaunt, guilt-ridden man he knew he would become. He was seeing the ghost of his own failure. End quote. "Lily." End quote. Ethan pleaded one last time, his voice barely a whisper. End quote. "Give me one more chance. Give us a chance." End quote. Lily shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't an Oppos. T a tear of anger, but of finality. End quote. "I can't, Ethan." End quote. She said softly. End quote. "I waited for years for you to choose me over your own confusion. I can't live in suspended animation, waiting to see if you will manage to stay in the room." End quote. She looked at Marcus, then back at Ethan, a profound sense of peace settling over her features that was completely absent when she looked at the man she once loved. End quote. "Marcus didn't walk out." End quote. She explained, her voice strong despite the tears. End quote. "He sat here. He listened. He didn't try to fix me, he just made sure I felt safe. I need stability, Ethan. I need someone who doesn't need a catastrophic glimpse into the future to realize I'm worth fighting for." End quote. Ethan felt the floor drop out from beneath him. This was the true collapse. It wasn't an Oppos. T the pain of the lost future. It was the pain of realizing he had failed his second chance by replicating the exact flaw he was supposed to overcome. He hadn't been beaten by time. He had been beaten by himself. Lily put her hand on Marcus's arm, a clear, definitive boundary set between them. End quote. Goodbye, Ethan. End quote. Ethan watched as they walked past him, their steps synchronized, moving toward a future that was calm, ordered, and entirely devoid of him. He reached out an empty hand, but he knew he had no right to touch her. The tragedy wasn't an Apos. That he went back in time and still lost her. The tragedy was that he went back in time and was still the same person. The moment was over. The future was sealed. He sank back against the cold glass of the cafe door, watching them exit into the afternoon light. He hadn't an Apos. He lost Lily to Marcus or to fate. He had lost her to the man he stubbornly refused to stop being. The image faded, leaving Ethan alone, shattered, leaning against the glass door of a life he had just irrevocably destroyed. Twice. Se que esta historia é intensa, e por isso que eu compartilho esses momentos. Se você valoriza a verdade e gosta de histórias que te fazem pensar sentir, faça o seguinte. Considera esse inscrever no canal e comente de qual cidade você está assistindo. O melhor jeito de garantir que você não perca a próxima lição de vida. Ethan stood there, outside the light of the cafe, the warmth of the future he had chased turning cold on his skin. He saw the truth, stark and painful. It wasn't an Apos, the time or Marcus or the universe that had taken Lily. It was him. He had walked out on her twice in the exact same moment, proving that the future he dreaded was merely a mirror of his own character. He had been given a gift few men ever receive, the ability to rewind the most devastating mistake of his life. Yet, when faced with the pressure of that exact moment, the panic, the insecurity, the desire to escape the immediate discomfort of conflict, overpowered his intent to change. He repeated the very action he had sworn to fix. The real lesson, the one that hit harder than any slap, was that knowing the future doesn't an Apos prevent you from being yourself. It only gives you advance notice of the disaster your habits will create. Regret is often romanticized as a desire to undo a single action, like a broken plate you wish to magically reassemble. But true regret, the kind that changes a person, is realizing that the action you regret was not an accident. It was inevitable, rooted deep in the person you were at that time. Ethan thought he was fighting a moment. He was actually fighting the ingrained pattern of avoidance that defined his character. He saw Lily laugh, a genuine, light sound that hadn't an Apos been part of their relationship for years, and that laugh wasn't an Apos directed at him. It was for Marcus, the man who stayed, the man who listened when Ethan walked away. This was the final, devastating gift of his journey. The realization that loving someone sometimes means accepting that they might find better peace without you, and that your own redemption is not tied to their return. We often ask for second chances, believing we just need a redo button. But life rarely gives a true redo. It gives consequences. Ethan was given a second chance, but he used it only to confirm his worst tendencies. The irony was devastating. He traveled through time to ensure Lily stayed, yet his fear and impatience were so ingrained that he became the instrument of his own loss. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of circumstance to a story of profound internal reckoning. Ethan finally understood that the damage was never the argument, but his willingness to abandon the connection the moment the argument became too real, too difficult, or too demanding of vulnerability. So, what does this entire tragic loop teach us? It teaches us that time is not the enemy. Time is neutral. We are the architects of our own emotional landscapes. Lesson 1. The impulse to flee is often louder than the commitment to stay. If you consistently choose the path of least immediate resistance, leaving, avoiding, shutting down, you are building a future defined by what you gave up, not what you fought for. Ethan's physical departure from the cafe was merely an external manifestation of his internal, constant flight from emotional responsibility. Lesson 2. True change is internal and painful. It is not a dramatic, cinematic turnaround. It is the quiet, agonizing choice to remain present when every fiber of your being screams for escape. Ethan needed to stand in the fire of that argument, not to win the point, but to prove to Lily, and more importantly to himself, that he could endure discomfort for the sake of connection. He failed that test twice. The universe granted him the time, but he failed to supply the emotional maturity. Lesson 3. Sometimes the greatest act of love is relinquishing control. Ethan's journey ended not when he tried to pull Lily back, which was his selfish desire, but when he stepped back completely, allowing her the space to choose happiness, even if that happiness was Marcus. He finally understood that his redemption was not dependent on her returning to him, but on him becoming the man who deserved her in the first place, regardless of who she chose. He had lost the woman, but he had finally found the wisdom. His loss of Lily was the catalyst for his self-discovery. He left the cafe that final time not consumed by hatred for Marcus, but consumed by the painful acceptance of his own profound fault. He would face the future alone, committed to rebuilding himself from the ground up, not for the reward of her love, but for the inherent necessity of being a stable, dependable man. This is the unexpected ending, not the grand reunion he hoped for, but the silent, profound internal shift he desperately needed. He lost Lily, yes, but he finally found Ethan. And that, the quiet voice concludes, is perhaps the most difficult, most vital second chance of all. Now, I want to know from you. Comment here below. What would have been your choice in my place? Would you have made this sacrifice? And if you like surprising endings, I left another video right here next to this one. It's a shocking story. Click there. I and Appos. LL see you in the next video.